once again, everyone. You better get started today. I have returned all of the homework that I have, that I've graded, so that should be on your desk. If not, I am here to you in person. So, we have that done. Okay, so a couple things. First of all, what I'd like to do is I'd like to tell you that I do want to collect one of the items today to grade, and that's going to be your part rating. Is that what you wanted?
Yes.
Okay. So, but before I do that, can I ask to see if anyone has any questions just on the part rating for right now? Okay, Haley?
I would love to go over like the last two words.
Okay.
How they should be each other.
Yeah, the last two chords, in other words, at the cadence, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a wise question because, again, I'm not assuming anything, but it tends to be the two chords at the cadence tends to be where the most part writing problems crop up. Okay? And it looks like in order to do that, I'm just going to have to do a little switcheroo here. So, let's do that first. Get a grand staff going. Looks like the first key is G major. So the penultimate chord, or the second to last chord, has an A in the bass. And there's a 7 and a sharp underneath it in terms of figures. This means 7, a seventh above the bass. This means a sharp third above the bass. And even though it doesn't show it, but it kind of infers a fifth above the bass too. If you can get it in there. Okay? Now, when I part wrote mine, depending on, or because of where I was coming from in the upper voices, I was not able to get a fifth in the chord in there. What I did is I used an incomplete 5/7. You remember our incomplete 5/7 chords? If we do use that, we can double the root, have a third, have a seventh, but no fifth in the chord. And that's what I did to get smoother part writing. I used an incomplete 5/7 chord. So basically what I did was I did this, based on where I was coming from. This is my 5/7. Notice it has two roots. I have two A's. I have a third of the chord, which is raised with a sharp, like the figure bass in the B. And I have a seventh. So I have A, C sharp, and G. I do not have an E or a fifth. Using an incomplete 5/7 allows me, or guarantees me, to be able to end up with a complete tonic. With a complete tonic. And by the way, does anyone know what is this? What is that right there? Is that a spaceship? Is it an alien aircraft? It's supposed to be a double whole note or a breath. Okay? And that's just the bass. That's just the bass. Now, your part writing may not be exactly like mine in this penultimate chord, the 5/7, which is eventually going to a 1. But you should have a C sharp and you should have a G in this chord. My C sharp is in an outer voice. And I'm in the key of D at this point. C sharp is the leading tone. of the key, and it's in an outer voice, so I have to take mine up. Finally, and I know a lot of students omit this or forget this or bypass this, what's the other tendency tone in this chord? The G, right? And where does the G have to go? It has to go down one step. And I have another A in the alto, so I can do this. And I end up with a complete chord. D major. So, what worked out for me best in the part writing was to use an incomplete 5/7. And because I did that, I was guaranteed to be able to end up with a complete tonic. 2 roots, a third, and a fifth in the final chord. But again, it's very important that in this chord here, you take the G, and whatever voice it's in, it's supposed to come down by step to F.
Would we be able to have an incomplete 1 chord then?
Say that one more
Could
time.
we have an incomplete 1 chord?
You could have an incomplete 1 chord, that's right, but you would need 3 Ds and 1 F.
Yes.
That's the correct way to do it.
So how would I set up this to that I'm doubling a D with a whole?
Yeah, like for instance, if you had the D doubled,
I have it doubled in this soprano.
oh, it's soprano. Well, let's put this back in here. I would just make it look like this then.
Okay.
Yeah. Other questions about the part writing before I pick that one? Did you all find the one modulation?
When you draw the line, do you draw like at the first chord of the modulation or after?
Yeah, so in a chromatic modulation, let's just pretend these are your 3 chromatic notes right here. I draw the line in the analysis, I draw it right in between the first 2, because this chord is analyzed, or this note is still a part of the old chord in the old key, but this one is part of the new chord in the new key. So whatever the key is here, like this is G and whatever that chord is, and then I mark the new key here and I start analyzing the new key. I come around and collect this sheet there, and then we'll take a look at the analysis part. And sure, your name is on that half sheet somewhere. And I'll take a look at it. Oh yeah, by the way, did you remember to circle the 3-note chromaticism? I don't want anyone to lose points. You can do that, or you can circle each note individually. I see you got it, so. Okay, I'll see what I can do. In the soprano, I think that's cool. In the inner voices, I think that's like good. Yeah, sometimes you can have inner voices really change. Okay?
I do also
Okay.
make it less. Discuss it. Okay. Exactly.
Okay, let's take a look at the analysis of the workbook. I think it was page 178 for you. I'll put my analysis up on the TV screen. Although I see there's one TV turned off. Off that one. Is that one still on? One little issue or beef that I have with the author here is that they didn't give you a lot of space to analyze underneath that first system. And I mean, they had the whole page, why couldn't they just spread it across? Okay, so in the first system, the opening key is A minor, the final key is also A minor. But there is a key in between. Let's see if we can work our way through this. Pickup chord is a 1.
Sorry, I can't see.
No, that's fine, that's fine. In the first full measure, I have 1, 5, 6, 1, 5, 4, 2, 1, 6. If on beat 3 of measure 1 you just want to analyze that as a 5 and call the D a passing tone, that would be fine. That would be fine. But I would definitely mark the D then as a passing tone, so I know. In the second full measure, the first chord is 7 diminished 6, followed by a 1. The chord under the first fermata is a 5, and the very next chord is 1. So far everything has been diatonic. In fact, I think every single chord here is diatonic. We don't have any secondary chords often using in this test. Now, I thought it was this is not easy, I will agree with you there. I thought it was kind of hard to identify the opening, or the first modulation, which is right here. The first modulation I have marked as a chromatic modulation, and the chromatic motion that I circled is in the tenor voice. There is a C on beat 1, a C sharp in the tenor on beat 2, and a D in the tenor on beat 3. Now, there is a neighbor tone in between beats 1 and 2, which I think gets in the way and causes confusion. But that's just a non-chord tone on the weak part of the beat. Really what we have is the chromatic motion C, C sharp, and D. And so I circled those 3 notes, I circled them individually, because whenever you see a chromatic modulation, you're supposed to circle the 3-note chromaticism in music. Notice that C sharp is T, or the leading tone in the new key, which it typically is in a chromatic modulation. Notice I drew my line in my analysis between the C and the C sharp. So the C is part of a 1 chord in the old key of A minor. The C sharp in the tenor is part of a 5, or you could call it a 5-4-2 in the new key of D minor. And the D in the tenor on beat 3 is part of a 1-6 in the new key of D minor. Then I followed that with a 2 half diminished 4-2 followed by a 5-6-5. That's all on B4. Look at the lower system. Still in D minor at this point, I have a 1 followed by a 5 followed by a 1. You see in measure 4 there, the chord under the fermata. That I found was a pivot chord back to the old key of A minor. And the reason I labeled that as a pivot chord is because going back to A minor, my next signal pitch would be C natural. C natural tells me I'm not in D minor anymore, but I'm back in A minor. So this beat I consider the signal chord because it contains the signal pitch. I always back up and look for a smooth pivot chord in the beat right before, and lo and behold, I found one. This D minor chord under the Cremata is a 1 in the old key of D minor, but it is a minor 4 in the new key of A minor. And then from that point on, I should be able to analyze all the chords from A minor to the end. But something was mentioned in your instructions above this. What key is this? Well, it's the end of beat 3 in the next to last measure. You see how there's an unusual bass position of a diminished triad here? It's a 7 diminished chord in root position. And that was mentioned up in the instructions up on your page. I think it asks, where is there a chord of an unusual position or something? Well, that's the one they're talking about right there. It's a 7 diminished chord, but in root position. And we normally use diminished triads in first inversion, not root position. The only other strange chord, which I would be fine if you completely overlooked or skipped, or considered as non-chord tones, is this one right here with the F sharp in the bass right on beat 3. That turns out to be a 6 half diminished 7 if you try to call it a chord. And that comes from the melodic minor scale. It is such a rare chord you don't even need to know about it, and I would be fine if you just skipped it. In fact, if you wanted to call some of these pitches down in the bass, if you wanted to call them passing tones, that would be certainly fine with me. Because it's such a bizarre chord. Notice that we end on a 5 chord in this passage, so it's a half cadence. It does not end on an A minor triad that we might expect. All right, that's not an easy passage to analyze. Does anyone have any comments or questions about that? I'd like to see if I can play this through the speakers in just a moment, but does anyone need some more clarification about it? Did you find, I know it's very hard, but did you find the chromatic modulation up in the first system? Yes. Do you see it now, though, where I point out the tenor C, C sharp, and D? Okay. Did you find a common chord or a pivot chord modulation in the second system here? Back to A minor. Oh, wait. Go ahead.
I haven't switched around. I have the pivot chord in the first system and the chromatic.
So you had a pivot chord modulation in the first system, and you tried it. Okay, what were you looking at for a chromatic modulation in the second
I
system?
don't know. I was having a real tough time finding it, but I didn't know it could be off and non-chord tone as well. I thought it would get
Yeah, the only thing I think that's tricky about this is that it's not, each note is not exactly successive one right after the other. The notes are actually on the beats. They're on the strong parts of the beat that you need to circle. But there's this little pesky neighbor tone that gets in the way that kind of, I know the first time I looked at it, it just kind of throws off my visuals, throws off my focus, and throws off my thinking. And it makes me think, well, it can't be there, even though it is. It can also be helpful to listen to these passages that you analyze, because your ear can sometimes tell you, well, even though I can't really find it just yet, it sounds like I know there's a modulation here. So I've got to look for something here. Yes?
So what if I had the second modulation down as a chromatic modulation?
Down here in the system?
Yes.
Well,
Would that be wrong?
yeah, it probably would be. What 3 notes of chromaticism were you looking at?
D, C natural, and B in the soprano voice.
I see that, yeah. So D to C natural is technically not half step chromatic motion.
Yes, I see that.
It's got to be by half step, yeah.
Okay.
Good question. Okay, let's, I think I have to turn this off, so watch in your own workbook so I can. I just need to connect on my device here. I think it's helpful though to be able to hear what he analyzed. So, this is 19, A2.
As 19.1, A2.
So then on the half cadence that Oh, by the way, if I give you a passage to analyze on the next test, it will not be as difficult as this. Any other questions about any of the homework before I move on to the future test?
So should I follow what it says in the
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, you were not required to answer the questions at the top of page 178, but I think what he's talking about is right here, you see how the tenor and the alto are more than often apart. Right in here. Yeah, it was in the next to last measure, there's a beat there, I think, where the tenor and the alto are more than an octave apart. And that's what the author was talking about there in terms of Bach uses, what does he say, what kind of chord spacing or just, that's the word, does not follow the convention. I guess we can't say Bach does anything cool, because he kind of helped develop these rules. But a nice way to put it is, yeah, he didn't follow the conventions. And that's what that was talking about. All right, let's go on to what we need to talk about for today. What I'd like to do is I'd like to explain to you or teach you how to write your own progression with Roman numerals that modulates. Okay? In other words, I know we're not necessarily taking the time out to compose and write passages and phrases that modulate. But if you are asked to write a passage with Roman numerals that modulate, we need to go through the steps of how to do that, so that you would know at least a little bit how to do that. And plus, I think it'll help you understand the process of modulation even a little bit better by going through this detailed process. Okay? So let's start by, well, let me make some, I need to put back what I got on the board. Let's say that you are asked on a future quiz or test to write a progression using Roman numerals that modulates, and you needed to show the bass notes of your Roman numerals in your progression. You don't have to part rate the whole thing. Just come up with a decent progression of Roman numerals that modulates, put it underneath the bass clefs down, and then show me the bass notes of the chords that you chose in the progression. That's kind of like a task that will eventually, well, you'll have that for homework, and then I'll probably even ask you to do a little bit of that on the next test. Now, how would you go about writing a progression? Let's say, first of all, let's pick the first one we talked about. A progression that modulates by common chord from G minor to C minor. I'm going to go through a list of steps. You're welcome to see if you can write these steps down in your notes, although you won't have to because the homework assignment that I give you for Friday has all the steps listed for you in order that you can follow. So if you just want to try to pay attention and see if you can follow my discussion, that should be fine. You don't have to put this, write this down in your notes. Okay. So let's pretend that we needed to write a progression with Roman numerals that modulates by common chord from G minor to C minor. The first step would be to write in the key signature for the first key. Oh, look, I've already done that. G minor's key signature is there. We're about 1/6 of the way through. Okay. Now, the next thing I would do is I would find the best or the smoothest pivot chord between these two keys by writing out a pivot chord chart. Remember our good old friend pivot chord chart? Let's do that. First key is minor, and I need to use the natural form of the minor to get the chord qualities of my Roman numerals. That's the first row in my pivot chord chart. Where does the minor 1 for C minor, under which G minor chord should I place it? So that the roots of the chord are aligned vertically. Or underneath the 4 chord, right? So I'm going to start the 1 chord of C minor right here, because the 4 chord in G has a root of C, and so does a 1 chord in C minor. And then from there I can just continue on. So I'm still in minor, so the 2 is diminished, the 3 is major, the 4 is minor, the 5 is minor, the 6 is major, and the 7 is major. What do I do next in my pivot chord chart? Cross out which columns? Yeah, the columns where the Roman numerals are of different type. So I would cross out this column, because this is an impossible chord to pivot around, or to use as a common chord between the two keys. Looks like I would cross out this column. It looks like I would cross out this column. Of the 4 pairs of chords that are left, that are potential pivot chords in a modulation between these 2 keys, which one would you circle? Yeah, I like this one. I think this is a real good one right here. That's a sweet one. It doesn't have any 5s involved. It doesn't have any 7s involved. So, I'm saying that because I went through the process that this chord, 4 in G minor, becoming 1 in C minor, that's going to be the smoothest pivot chord in a modulation between these 2 closely related keys. And I'm going to use this pivot chord in the progression that I write. Now, we just found the best pivot chord between the 2 keys. Where do you think I should place this pivot chord in my progression that I'm going to write here? Should I place it like right at the beginning? Should I place it at the very, very end? The best place to put it is roughly in the middle of your progression. So, let's see, I don't remember how many chords I used. Let's put it right about here. Yeah. So the best place to put your pivot chord is about right in the middle, halfway through your progression. Now, what we need to do next, the next step, is to choose a chord that follows the pivot chord. A chord that will be in the new key that will contain a signal to the new key. Because if this is our pivot chord, we want the next chord to be a signal chord, which is where it normally is. And signal chords, by definition, contain the signal. Well, I need to know then what are my possible signals to go from G minor to C minor. And we think of those very quickly here. The difference between the two key signatures tells us that what is going to be in C minor that's not in D. A flat, that's one signal. These are both minor keys. What is the lowering of T in G minor going to give us? F natural, not F sharp. And what is T of the new key? B natural. So there are three signal pitches to get me from G minor to C minor. I want to choose a chord that fits in C minor, right here, put about right here after the pivot, that contains one of these signals. Yeah, I was going to say, let's just use a 5 chord, right? Because a 5 chord in C minor is going to have a B natural. In fact, what I did is I used a 5/7, because not only will a 5/7 have a B natural, it'll also have an F natural. It has two signals. But 5 would be just fine, because it contains a signal pitch. Okay, I decided to use a 5/7 in that inversion. You tell me, what chord must come after a 5/4/2? We learned this. A 1 what? That's right, 1/6. Now, the next step. I've got my pivot chord prepared, set up. I've got my signal chord set up. Before the pivot chord now, we need to add some chords that will support the first key. Let's try to make sure we use either acceptable or well-formed progressions, or an acceptable or one well-formed progression. This is what I did. I ended up doing something like this. 1, 6, 5, 6, 5, and 5, 5, 4, 2. I'm not even lined up. Let me see if I can just get this a little bit more lined. I'm going to try to do a chord on each beat of the measure, and I'm in 4/4 meter. There. This happens to be a well-formed progression from here to here. Tonic, predominant, ultra strong, steroid predominant, dominant, tonic. By the way, I would say try to use 4 to 5 chords to establish the opening key. 4 to 5 chords before your modulation. Let's see if we can use about 4 or 5 chords after the modulation to establish or confirm the new key so that our ears can adjust. So that's the next thing we do. After the signal chord, add chords to support the second key. So this is what I did. I think I've exhausted all the beats in measure 2. So I ended up doing something like this. And you don't have to be this fancy. I used another well-formed progression. Tonic, these two chords are predominant. The 1, 6, 4 to 5 combo is dominant. The 1 chord is top. And the last thing we need to do is write out the bass notes for the Roman numerals that we've chosen. So the bass note of a 1 chord in G minor is G. The bass note of a 6 chord is E flat. the bass note of a 5, 6, 5 of 5 is C sharp. The bass note of a 5, 4, 2 in G minor is C natural. And 5, 4, 2, let's go to 6. So the bass note is B flat. What's the bass note of the pivot chord? C, right? Because it's a C minor triad. I'm sorry. I did this wrong. I had in my notes, I have this, 5, 4, 3. That way I'm going to get a stepwise baseline. Now again, you don't have to worry about, so you don't have to make your baseline stepwise, you don't have to make it fancy schmancy or anything like that. You don't have to necessarily use this many chords either on each side of the modulation. But I would, as long as you can come up with a well-formed or acceptable progression on this side and one on this side of your modulation, make sure you start on one, make sure you end on one in the new key, these kinds of things. I think these are pretty standard, pretty basic, and I would hope that you'd be able to do that. Okay? Hope that you'd be able to do that. End with 5-1. That will help establish your new key. Start with a 1. That will help establish your old key. These kinds of things, to me, are common sense. But again, you don't have to make it as fancy or that elaborate. Just as long as you're paying attention, you're knowing what you're doing, and that your bass notes match the chords and the inversions that you've chosen. So let's see what a passage like this would sound like. You don't have to do any of the part writing. I've done the part writing so you can at least hear what it sounds like. I think we chose a particularly smooth pivot chord, right? It wasn't jarring to go from G minor to C minor, right? We just kind of, I don't want to say melted or phased in there, but we got there. Okay, does anyone have any questions about this? All right. And the last thing I want to go through is just how to do the same thing, how to write a progression with Roman numerals and bass line, but using a chromatic modulation. And for this one, I'm going to ask you to think about how to write the Roman numerals for a progression that modulates chromatically from A minor to D minor. D is in dog. Am I going to need to write out a pivot chord chart to find a smooth pivot chord if I'm writing a progression with a chromatic modulation? Nope. Pivot chord charts are completely unnecessary when you're dealing with chromatic modulation. You don't need to go down that road. First thing I would do to write the progression that's got a chromatic modulation is I would write the key signature of the first key. I got nothing here. That's okay. Because my first key is A minor. That's already taken care of. Now, the next thing I would do is immediately determine the signal pitches or the signal accidentals between the two keys. And I said the two keys are A minor and D minor. Okay. What note occurs in D minor that is different between the key signature?
B flat.
B flat, right? the lowering of T to T in the old key would give me what signal pitch?
G natural.
G natural. No longer G sharp. And finally, what is T of the new key? G sharp, right? That's the leading tone of G minor. Now, we got three signal pitches with a chromatic modulation. If one of the signal pitches is T in the new key, choose that pitch. Is one of these three signal pitches the leading tone in the new key? You bet it is. It's this one right here. Now, where are we going to place this pitch in the progression? Right at the beginning, at the very end, or somewhere in the middle? Somewhere in the middle. So, I did mine. I put it up kind of high in the base. Oh, I don't have enough room for this. You know what? I'm just gonna lower my base off. There it is. There's my signal pitch. Placing approximately halfway through the progression. Now, approach T with the diatonic version of this pitch. What note should come right before this in order to create three-note chromatic? C natural. That's right. Resolve T to what T usually resolves to when it's in an outer voice. Remember, we're writing a bass line. So this is going to go to E. There's our three-note chromaticism for our bass line in this chromatic modulation. What do we have to do always? Are we losing points? Circle the chromaticism. Circle the chromaticism. Okay, now, where's the dividing point between the old key and the new key in terms of chords?
Between the first and second one.
That's right, between the first and second one. Good. So, D minor is going to start right here. What's a possible chord that we can put right here to have harmonize when we got C sharp in the bass? And a chord that fits in D minor. 5/6. I couldn't come up with a better chord. 5/6 or 5/6/5. And where does 5/6 go with D in the bass in the next chord? Now, remember the C natural out here, that's the bass note to a chord in the old key. What chord do you want to put right here in the old key of A minor to work with a C in the bass? What's one of the simplest ones you can think of? I can understand if you're thinking the capital 3, because that would be a C. But, I don't know. 3 chords are just kind of lousy. What about a 1/6 in A minor? Yeah. That'll work with a C in the bass. Okay. This is basically the main, this is the, 90% of your progression, your logical progression right here. Now, support each of the keys with normal, acceptable, or well-formed progressions as we did in the progression above. So I just got to come up with some chords that establish help A minor. By the way, using 1s and 5s, tonics and dominants, those are the easiest, best chords to use to establish a key, because you hear tonic and you hear the leading tone over and over again. So this is what I did. 1, 5, 4, 3. Whoops. I'm going to space this out just a little bit more. 1, 6, 5, 4, 2. 1 for each beat of the measure. 1, 5, 1, that's an acceptable compression. 151 is another acceptable progression, not well formed, but it's acceptable. Now I gotta come up with a progression to finish off and fill out the rest of the area in D minor. So what I ended up doing was I ended up writing a 2-6 here, and then I just did 2 chords here. Really broad ones, 1, 6, 4, 5, and 1. Now can you help me fill in the bass notes to these chords? The bass note of a 1 chord in A minor is A. I want a 5, 4, 3. B. I want a 1, 6. Is this kindergarten?
Feels like
A, B, C? A 5, 4, 2. D. Okay, fine, we're off of that. We're off of that train. The seventh of this 5, 4, 2, which is in the bass, has to go down by a step. So that's why 5, 4, 2 goes to 6. Now we're shifting gears. We're in D minor over here. What is the bass note of a 2 diminished 6? G. And then the bass notes of both a potential 6/4 and a 5. And then the bass note of a 1/4. So let's see, I'll play this. I did all the part writing. You don't have to do the part writing for the homework, obviously. I did all the part writing so I could play the harmonies, and let's see what this modulation, chromatic modulation sounds like. I'm going to play the bass an octave higher so I can reach it. Okay, so A minor is the opening key. Hear the chromatic shift into D minor. All right. So we're out of time. As I said before, I think the only homework that you have for next class is the handout. And I have, wherever I have this handout, here it is. I have all the steps you need to follow to write a progression with a common chord modulation, and to come up with a progression for a chromatic modulation. The steps should all be right here on the sheet, so just follow them, and I'm hoping that'll be enough. You can always come see me for help or Micah. And when you get this assignment, you can go ahead and leave.